For the first time in its modern history, British horse racing will voluntarily grind to a halt for a single day. On Wednesday, the 10th of September, no fixtures will be held anywhere in Britain. This extraordinary move is part of an organized strike led by the British Horse Racing Authority (BHA) in response to government proposals to raise taxes on betting. The protest is not just a symbolic gesture. It represents a watershed moment for a sport that prides itself on tradition and continuity. Racing has survived world wars, recessions, and even the pandemic with only limited interruptions. To willingly down tools and silence the thundering hooves on the turf sends a stark message to Westminster. The government's proposed tax reforms could destabilize one of Britain's oldest and most cherished sports. The controversy centers on the Treasury's plan to standardize online betting duties into a single tax rate. Currently, betting on horse racing is taxed at 15%, while online casino games and slots face a higher rate of 21%. The government has argued that unifying the system would simplify bureaucracy and ensure consistency across the gambling sector. A Treasury spokesperson explained, "We are consulting on bringing the treatment of online betting in line with other forms of online gambling to cut down bureaucracy. It is not about increasing or decreasing rates, and we welcome views from all stakeholders including businesses, trade bodies, the third sector, and individuals. But for the horse racing industry, the implications are far from neutral." Economic Analysis Commission by the BHA warns that if racing were taxed at the higher rate, the sport could lose £330 million in revenue over the first 5 years. That would translate into 2,752 jobs lost in the first year alone, with further long-term consequences for employment across training yards, racecourses, and rural communities that depend heavily on the racing economy, which fixtures are affected. To clear the calendar for the strike, for meetings originally scheduled for the 10th of September have been rescheduled. Lingfield Park afternoon moved to the 8th of September afternoon. Carlisle afternoon moved to the 9th of September evening. Uttoxeter afternoon moved to the 11th of September evening. Kempton Park evening moved to the 15th of September evening. This reshuffling ensures that racehorses and participants do not lose their events entirely. However, the blank day remains deeply symbolic. The move is calculated to maximize visibility, occurring just before the St. Leger Festival at Doncaster, one of Britain's most prestigious race meetings and a favorite event of Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, who attended in 2023. What happens on the 10th of September? On the day of the strike, racecourses across Britain will stand silent. Instead of saddling up, leading jockeys, trainers, and owners will gather at Westminster to lobby members of Parliament directly. The BHA hopes that the absence of racing, combined with a strong lobbying presence, will hammer home the seriousness of the threat posed by the tax reforms. Racing's leaders want to stress that the sport is not just another branch of gambling, but a cultural institution with intricate traditions, deep ties to rural communities, and a role as the second largest spectator sport in Britain after football. Meanwhile, racing will continue as normal in the Republic of Ireland, where Cork will stage the day's sole fixture in the British Isles. At the heart of the debate is the fear that raising the betting duty on racing would make the sport less attractive to bookmakers and punters alike. Currently, major bookmakers contribute to the sport through a 10% levy on profits from horse racing bets, which generates over £100 million annually. This money flows directly into prize money and initiatives that sustain the racing ecosystem. If the proposed tax rise makes racing less profitable for bookmakers, industry leaders worrying that bookmakers will scale back sponsorships and marketing tied to racing. Customers will receive poorer odds and fewer bonuses, making racing less appealing compared to other gambling options. Punters may drift toward unregulated black market operators, depriving the sport of both revenue and oversight. This comes at a time when racing has already been squeezed by affordability checks designed to combat problem gambling, which have reduced betting turnover. For a sport that depends on betting to fund its prize money and infrastructure, the cumulative pressure could prove crippling. Not everyone in the industry agrees with the strike, but many leading figures have spoken out strongly in support. Nicky Henderson, one of the country's most successful jumps trainers, admitted he is not naturally inclined toward industrial action, but believes the severity of the threat justifies it. I am not necessarily a person who is in favor of using strikes as a tool, but the message has got to get across that this tax could be crippling. It is not a weapon I would ordinarily suggest we turn to, but under the circumstances, I would say we probably have little choice. On the other hand, the Betting and Gaming Council BGC, which represents betting shops, online betting and gaming operators, and casinos, criticized the decision. In a strongly worded statement, the BGC said, "Racing's decision to reschedule fixtures was taken without consultation with betting operators, whose support for the funding of the sport is mission critical. We are concerned that futile political gestures will only antagonize the government and frustrate punters instead of delivering a solution to a shared challenge facing both racing and betting." The tension between racing's governing body and betting operators reveals the complexity of the relationship. The two sectors are intertwined financially, yet they sometimes find themselves at odds when it comes to how revenues should be shared or regulated. Financially, the one-day strike is not expected to devastate the sport. Because the affected fixtures have been rescheduled, most of the revenue will still be recouped. However, the BHA estimates a loss of around £200,000 in turnover from the strike day itself. For the BHA, that is a price worth paying. Chief Executive Brant Dunsha emphasized the importance of sending a clear signal. It's certainly not a decision we have taken lightly. The industry is united in saying that cost is a small price to pay for ensuring we send a clear and loud message to government. Racing is more than just a sport. It's a cherished part of our culture, and we are a major employer. We are different to online casinos. One of the strongest arguments the BHA and its supporters make is that racing should not be lumped in with other forms of online gambling. Whereas slot machines and online roulette are pure games of chance with fixed margins for operators, horse racing demands skill, study, and knowledge. Punters examine form guides, assess jockeys and trainers, and weigh countless variables before placing a bet. The experience is participatory, intellectual, and tied to centuries of tradition. Moreover, racing sustains rural economies in ways that online gambling never could. Breeding operations, training yards, transport companies, veterinary services, and countless small businesses rely on the sport's survival. To subject it to the same tax regime as online casinos, racing leaders argue, ignores its cultural and economic distinctiveness. Is this strike a one-off for now? Yes. The BHA has stressed that no further strikes are planned. The action is deliberately framed as a one-time statement aimed at drawing maximum attention to its Axe the Racing tax campaign. The campaign, which launched earlier in the summer, has already gained traction. Its online petition had attracted around 10,000 signatures by the time the strike was announced on the 16th of August, a number expected to rise as the protest day approaches. Whether this single strike will be enough to influence government policy remains uncertain. Much will depend on how MPS respond to the lobbying event in Westminster and whether the Treasury remains open to compromise after its consultation period. The strike highlights a broader debate about the future of gambling regulation in Britain. Successive governments have sought to balance two competing goals, protecting vulnerable consumers from gambling harm while also sustaining industries, like racing, that depend on betting revenues. For critics of the gambling industry, the Treasury's proposal looks like a step toward fairness and responsibility. For those inside racing, it looks like an existential threat that could erode the sport's financial foundations. What is clear is that the 10th of September strike will go down as a landmark moment in racing history. Whether it proves to be a turning point in government policy or just a dramatic but ultimately symbolic protest remains to be seen. On the 10th of September, the racecourses of Britain will fall silent. No thundering hooves at Lingfield, no roaring crowds at Carlisle, no fences at Uttoxeter, no floodlights at Kempton. Instead, the sport's leading voices will stand in the corridors of Westminster, making their case face-to-face with lawmakers. It is an extraordinary gamble from a sport that knows a thing or two about risk. But for the British Horse Racing Authority and its supporters, the stakes could not be higher. Jobs, communities, and the very future of racing as a distinct cultural institution. Whether this bold strike forces the government to rein in its tax reforms or simply hardens its resolve will shape the next chapter in the centuries-old relationship between betting, racing, and the state.